All right, Lily, so thank you so much for meeting with me today for our pre-conference. I know that your lesson is Wednesday. I'm really looking forward to seeing that. So remember, the whole purpose of this pre-conference is really just to walk through your lesson, to get you ready for any questions that you might have. We're going to look at some of that student data that you've taken in for pre-test, and then we're just going to focus on one specific component for you to think about for Wednesday's lesson, okay? I want to hear about the growth and where you are in terms of your thinking. So tell me about your lesson topic.
Okay, so this unit is about the warmth of other suns. That's the book that we are reading, and it's about the Great Migration, which is the movement of African Americans from the South to the North for a better life. And I really wanted to incorporate that peer-to-peer assessment and the technology use, because last semester that is something that I really discussed in my goals, definitely with you, and just that I saw I wanted to improve on. So basically, the students are only reading one migrant, and this lesson is going to give them the opportunity to read the other two migrants as well, because they're going to do 3 switches that means like, so if I'm the Ida person, I will get to meet George or Pershing, because they never get to meet another migrant.
Okay. And so you mentioned that these were some of your goals from last semester from Collaborative Conference. So what specifically were your goals, and how were you mindful of those as you prepared for this lesson?
So one of my specific goals was incorporating more technology. It's funny because usually more old school people like the paper copies, and I'm like, I guess, new school, whatever. But I like paper copies, so I wanted to challenge myself to use and incorporate more technology. So that's where it came with the pre-test that I gave them. They did it on a Google form, which was used their Chromebooks for. And then I also wanted to do peer-to-peer assessment, because a lot of what you can learn from the students are learning is what they talk to about with each other. So you can hear in their conversations like if they've mastered a skill or versus if they still need some additional help.
Okay, and I definitely want to unpack a little bit more in just a minute about that peer-to-peer assessment and
Okay.
kind of hear about that measurement. So you talked about the connection with our collaborative conference that we did, but also from your last walkthrough, what did you take away from your last walkthrough on what you really need to focus on for this specific lesson?
So for my last walkthrough, I think I did a really good job at giving them an assessment, but not necessarily how I was going to score them on that assessment. And so that's why I really incorporated this writer's checklist, well, the performance criteria, as well as the rubric in which I'm grading them on. And that is why everything is so outlined and really tied together, because it's split into those different sections. And I didn't really have that in my last walkthrough, because you always want to know what you're graded on, right? And they didn't have that. So that was something I really wanted to show in this lesson.
Perfect. So we're actually going to, again, kind of unpack that a little bit more for sure. So certainly leave that out.
The main focus point of this lesson is getting the other students to see that even though they are reading about one specific migrant, that the other 2 migrants that their classmates are reading about, they really do like intertwine together. They have some similar obstacles, some similar conflicts that they may have been through, and like the reasons for leaving the South are more similar than they think.
Okay. So it sounds like you've been really purposeful in designing that instruction to match those standards and objectives.
Yes.
How has that played a part, the alignment in this assessment? What were you thinking about in terms of your formal and informal assessment? How are you going to know during class along the way if they're really meeting that goal? And then what might that look like at the end of your lesson?
So I have a few different informal assessments, and I definitely have incorporated some turn-in talks to where, like I said, I think students, whenever they talk to each other, you can gather a lot more than just in a whole class discussion. So those turn-in talks are really going to establish if that connection is being made with somebody else, because they also go through 3 different changes with the 3 different migrants, Ida, George, and Pershing, and eventually they'll be placed in a group with the 3 different migrants. So I'm really going to, it's those turn-in talks, then there's the bell ringer. I have some activity with modeling how their work should be. up to that certain standard, and definitely an exit ticket at the end.
Okay. So those, I'm really glad that you have a wide variety of that informal assessment. Let's focus on, though, this formal assessment. How did you really make that distinct connection between how you're going to measure that mastery at the end and really know that they've met this standard and objective? What are you thinking about that?
Well, it really comes into play with my pre-test and my post-test. So the pre-test was basically, they answered some questions about the push and pull factors of the Great Migration, which is really where those, the question is answered about the push factors, what pushed them out of the South. And then they move into actually writing and collecting that evidence, which was the pre-test. So I'm really trying to measure the growth of their explanations from the pre-test to what they actually write in their formal assessment. Because the part of the group work is that they're able to collaborate with one another and say, oh, your piece of evidence is so much better than mine. I think we should use that. And then together they can sit there and explain and do it on more of just a repetition of the quote. They need to establish like a further analysis of the quote.
So I'm really glad that you mentioned, speaking about that clear measurement criteria. You just mentioned a performance checklist, also a rubric. So I'm assuming that that's, again, what you're going to be using to measure,
Yes.
right, that student learning. So talk to me about the relationship between the performance criteria and then the rubric. How do those align, and then what were you thinking about that in terms of implementation?
So whenever they first start to write, they'll be given this performance criteria writer checklist. And as you can see, I have specific questions like, does my response answer all parts of the question? It's 2 parts. Is my claim well developed? Is my paragraph logical and easy to understand? And with the rubric, it's split into those similar sections: response, evidence, explanation, significance, and grammar and mechanics. And I have it individually, like this is response, this is evidence, this is explanation, significance, grammar and mechanics. So it's really like aligned that way to where if they just looked at this and they are able to answer each question, check it off, make sure they went through their paper and said, yes, I did this, yes, I did that, then they should really have at least a two on each of their parts of the rubric.
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about this actual performance criteria. So how do you envision using that during the class? When are they using that? How are they using that? And then we'll talk about the rubric.
So I do a modeling section before I split them into their groups. And that is with a quote that from their first section assessment that was very, very common to use, because one of the questions for that specific assessment was, what is the definition of the Great Migration? And there really wasn't many different quotes to pull from, so a lot of them use the same quote. So that's why that was my choice in using this specific quote, and I'm going to have that posted on the board as well. But I'm going to go through myself and use this checklist, which will be posted on the board, and say, okay, this answers this goes through this. And I'm really focusing definitely on the evidence and explanation, like the intro to my evidence, writing my evidence, and that explanation, because that's really where the bulk of the points are coming from, like what I want to see that improvement in.
Okay, so it sounds like you're going to be using your modeling skills to provide an exemplar for them while also
Yes.
being cognizant of this checklist as well. Okay, so then tell me a little bit about the rubric at the end. Who's completing this? How do you envision that being implemented?
So this is a peer review rubric. So the students are actually going to be assessing one another. I mentioned already from my collaborative conference, I said I really wanted to incorporate that peer-to-peer rubric because, believe it or not, the students like to point out, like, hey, I think you need to do this better, or I think that you did this well, but let me see if I can work on my paper a little better. It's like they just have that same language and they understand one another sometimes better than what a teacher can communicate to them. So that's where the peer review rubric really comes in, and it outlines each individual like score. So a 3 they'll get if they answer both questions and the response is organized, and it has those exact criteria for each score that their partner or their classmate will be giving them.
And you mentioned that it was specifically aligned with this performance criteria as well,
Yes.
correct? Okay. So it looks like So if we are, playing through this and you and I are partners and I get to score you, so then how do you plan for each partner to give feedback to each other rather than them just switching papers?
Yes.
And talk about the importance of why you would have that feedback in there.
So they're not only just going to switch their papers back with each other, I also have some structured time in there. This part of the lesson is going to take approximately 13 minutes, and I have the last 3 minutes as time for the students to discuss with one another, like, I think you did this well in your paper, or I saw this, I think you can improve this. Like, really give compliments as well, but also if there was something that they needed to work on, that they are like shown to work on that. I have like the expectations too, of course, like be nice and be positive still, even if it's a negative comment. But I have that structured time in there to where they can talk with one another about the things that they saw in their paper.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a great opportunity for them to give some peer-to-peer assessment. One of the things I do want you to focus on, to be really mindful of, is for them to focus on the evidence that the rubric shows. So, you know what I'm saying? Rather than saying, hey, you did a really nice job here. Have them really structure and talk about what from the rubric, what evidence did they see, or maybe what evidence did they not see. So really just honing in on this rubric when they have those structured conversations. I think that's going to be really valuable as well.
I'm going to encourage them also to write notes or like make highlights and things in the margin of whatever, like the paper they do receive to grade, because I want that person to receive feedback. Like
That's
when
great.
a teacher grades a paper, they don't just, usually, they don't just give it with a grade on it. There's feedback, there's things to improve on, and I really want the students to see that as well.
Okay, well, I'm really excited to see that, especially since that was one of our goals from last semester. So I think that's going to be important. So let's take a little look at your data from your pretest, from your SAC. So when we look at your student achievement chart and we look at these 4 levels from falls, far below, approaches, meets, and exceeds. So tell me a little bit about this data, meaning was there anything that surprised you about the performance of the students from these levels?
Nothing necessarily surprised me, only because I know that a few of them are definitely in the approaches and falls far below. A few of them are struggling to make more of an analysis in their explanations. And in the meets category, even though that is majority of where the students are, I still think that they can be pushed even further to be placed in the exceeds category.
So let's park on that for just a second. So it looks like 38% of your students, 11 of your students, are at either approaches or falls far below. Now, again, that's not uncommon because you haven't taught the lesson yet. But you did talk about challenging them a little bit more. So what are some specific ways that you plan on pushing them just a little bit more in class to make sure that they are making those strides towards that meets level?
So I think for the students that are in the approach category or the falls far below category, I've noticed that they really appreciate when we provide templates for them, or examples of what we're expecting. Like if it's a worksheet, it's at the top where the directions would be, those examples of a good work. But definitely encouraging and implementing those templates that they can fill in. I noticed that with the last section assessment, whenever we gave every student the opportunity to use a certain claim template, and most of them took that and ran with it, and they did a great job, and some of them just filled it in and did what they needed to do. So I think giving those students who may have fallen a little behind that opportunity to fill in and see exactly what they need is going to help them in the future as well.
So it sounds like more just explicit instruction for them
Yes.
to just really make sure that they're mastering that objective.
So they know what to include.
Okay. So let's talk about the flip side. Let's talk about, you had 6 of your students, so 21% are already at the exceeds level, and then 12 students are at the meets level. So now the challenge becomes, how do you continue to make strides when they're already at that level? So what are you thinking about for this specific group of students who are at it or just a little bit above it?
So I think it would be better for them to have more specific questions. So the questions I asked for this particular writing assignment was what was your migrants' life like in the South and how did it influence them to migrate? So instead of it being more of a broad question, I would maybe give them a direction in which to go through, because most of the, well, not most, the three of the migrants have been through some sort of conflict dealing with racial segregation, like sharecropping or Jim Crow laws. So maybe I think it would be beneficial to them to ask certain questions about those topics to where they really couldn't find evidence just from any of the pages, because there are a good amount of pieces of evidence from just about push factors. But if it's about specific push factors, I think that would challenge them a little more to find more beneficial evidence.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's one next step for you between now and Wednesday is to really focus on, what 2 or 3 questions can you provide so that as you're actively supervising, you can challenge them just a little bit more when you see that they're there. So that's certainly one task that, I want to write down that you can kind of think about for Wednesday. So as we sort of wrap up a little bit, we did talk about a few steps before Wednesday. So talk to me about what specific steps are your biggest priorities for Wednesday?
I think definitely walking around and having prepared those higher order thinking questions for whenever they're in their group work, completing their group work, to make sure that not only they're on track, but to make sure they're able to see like the ins and outs of the questions and make sure that they're on track to answering and providing a very good example of the paragraph.
Okay. Anything else that you're thinking about before Wednesday for next steps?
Not necessarily. I really want to harp on the peer review rubric and the performance criteria checklist. I just really want them to see the correlation of both of these things, because we always give them a checklist and a rubric, but sometimes I feel like they just kind of look at it and out the window. But for this lesson, I really want them to honestly just look at this part until they get to the peer review and say, oh, wow, I did all of this already because I looked at the checklist. So I'm really going to be focused on stressing this performance criteria and rubric.
Perfect. Those were the 2 things that I had in terms of moving you in that direction for. Remember, the 2 biggest words I want you to consider are alignment and assessment for Wednesday. And so those were the things that I wrote down as well. Certainly just making sure you're hitting home the fact of that peer review rubric and how does that align with that assessment at the end.
Yes.
And then, I love that there's going to be some student-to-student interaction, and they're really going to unpack what that looks like and be able to give each other evidence. So I'm looking forward to seeing that as well. And then one other thing I just wrote was, just be mindful of those opportunities to respond for sure, making sure that as you're actively supervising, you're providing those not only higher order questions, but also really making sure it's explicit for those students who are maybe below level as well, to maybe just keep them focused.
Questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Keep probing and prompting is certainly the name of the game.